Well, good morning. I usually record at night, but I was so exhausted last night I left it for another 12 hours, and I wake up this morning, I look like death warmed up, so apologies for that. But I know you guys, or quite a few of you, are waiting for this video, so I'll get on with it, bite the bullet, and I'll grab a coffee as soon as possible. Okay, so this week we got two chapters. We got the perception, decision making, and we got motivation. Both of them good, strong, big core topics within psychology. Perception and decision making less strong within OB, but deservedly having a place here, I think, as we'll see shortly. I've reversed the chapters around for some reason, so I'll start off with motivation, which is the stronger subject. Those two little slides simply talk about the overview of the chapters, but as you know, I always like to keep these videos as economic as possible, but that doesn't mean having white screens. What's going on here? Okay, I think we're moving. Okay, let's see this video. Wouldn't play yesterday, but it is an excellent video in that it illustrates the three key characteristics of motivation. And whereas I say here, for an individual, we can replace it for a cat. So the cat wants his master to wake up, and he's certainly showing the persistence required. There's a series of these, by the way, and they're all very well drawn and very funny. Yep. So there's definitely a direction to the cats. I mean, he's focused on a particular task, a particular goal. And take that for intensity. And look, peacefully sleeping as if nothing's happened. And I've just woken up. Good to see you. So that definitely is a very good, short visual explanation of what motivation is. Directed, intense. Intentional, as in deliberate, and persistent. Oh, yeah, I was just going to make the point is that, you know, in relation to perception as well, when humans perceive, you know, for example, two dots hovering around randomly on a screen, they will tend to think one dot is chasing the other. So humans actually see intention and motivation, even when it doesn't exist. We look at clouds in the sky and say that cloud is chasing that one, particularly as kids, you know. We see the sun and the clouds and the moon all with you know, some degree of humanity, some degree of personality, and some degree of motivation to them. So, a few of you will have been familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This type of thing sometimes gets even taught in high school. So we'll quickly skip over this, but Maslow is a chap operating, I think, in the 1950s when this Maslow's pyramid became famous initially, and it's held its own quite well ever since. So at the base is these physiological needs: food, drink, sleep. Even they put sex on that the bottom level of the first order of needs. When those needs have been satisfied, then humans are able to attend to the next level of needs, which this is how it's hypothesized or theorized to operate. They can attend to their safety needs, but they will risk safety, for example, if their food needs aren't met. So people will, you know, literally run over hot coals, risking the safety of their feet if there's food on the other side, for example, or go sailing on dangerous seas to fish, for example. Belonging needs is the next level. When safety and physiological needs have been satisfied, we move up to the next level, which is, the relationships and need for affection and contact. Esteem relates to how we feel about ourselves, of course, and self-actualization is like an extreme form of esteem, and I often use Gandhi as an example of a fully self-actualized man, someone who really has a very strong sense of having of needing to achieve something, to make himself or herself significant, and fully realizing who they are and their place in the universe. There's a lot of interesting twists now on Maslow's pyramid when we think about it from a modern day perspective, where really the physiological base is fully covered. Very few of us, if you go into supermarkets or living in a country where we have unemployment benefit, for example, do not have the core physiological needs met. And such is the comfort of our society that we are actually able to look upon violating our safety needs, but jumping off bridges and out of planes, as a form of entertainment. It certainly is a lesson on how comfortable society has become. But the assumptions of these kind of stage theories, as they're called, is that, distant combinations don't happen, which means, you don't actually get to self-actualize immediately after your physiological needs have been satisfied. You need to go through the stages. And that's the stage progression one, and also that the top of the pyramid is where we're all aiming for in some sort of deeper sense through life. We're all ending up or aiming towards self-actualization, when a lot of people might be perfectly happy finishing off at the mid-ranked level of the pyramid. There's a number of other nice little theories that are worth mentioning. This one's a little bit controversial insofar as it's considered to be quite discredited, but McGregor theories often divide the world up into little simple clumps. It makes us feel comfortable when we can break the world down into a few sentences, a couple of lines, a couple of hypotheses. This one's got a bit of intuitive sense to it. Managers will see employees as either with a dark view or a light view. Now, the dark view suggests that, the people we get as staff, they have little ambition, they don't like work, and they'll shirk responsibility wherever possible. But theory Y, managers will see the employees with lots of potential, as a potential to accept responsibility and direct their own actions and enjoy work, basically. It's probably true that employees do, to some degree, I'm recording at home where the road is fairly noisy, I'll close that, probably managers see the employees who walk into their office looking for a job, or potential employees, candidates, as being one or the other to some degree. And we have our prejudices and our leanings, but it's unlikely that we think of all employees as one way or all as the other way. Herzberg's two-factor theory is an interesting one. I'm always very annoyed by the terminology of hygiene versus motivators, which you'll see in the textbook. And the hygiene elements are the work conditions, such as pay, availability of childcare facilities, annual leave, and other award provisions, for example. And motivators are characteristics of the work itself, which, if you want to think about it in the terms which I'll talk about it today, these ones are the external conditions that relate to extrinsic motivators for work, hygiene factors, and the motivators are the intrinsic motivators for work, which are the joy of achieving something, or the joy of being successful and skillful at a particular act. He got all this from a large survey of I think, 2 or 3,000 from memory, I can't remember actually, interviews with employees about what made them feel good about the job. I think one of the things that's very interesting about Herzberg's two-factor theory is that he sees these two categories as having quite a different scale, not from very bad to very good, leaving people very unhappy to very happy, but are quite different. So he reckons with pay conditions, for example, that just to take an example of hygiene factors, when you're paid badly, you feel miserable. But when you're paid well, you feel okay, not brilliant. So you're over here on the negative side, somewhere between miserable and middle of the road. And you'll notice here that with salary, that sort of reflects that to some degree. Whereas with the motivators, you go from a neutral point. If your job is boring, such as making pizza after pizza, or assembling widgets on a mass production factory, you go from work's okay through to if you are doing something you really enjoy at work, that the work is very motivating, to use Herzberg's terminology, then you feel great. So, in fact, these motivators are a much more useful area to work in than these hygiene factors, which are, to use the term that's sometimes used in psychology or OB, is satisficing, just getting to the level of being satisfied rather than a brilliant result. So those who tended to feel good listed, the intrinsic, the internal motivators. The problem is that it hasn't been well supported by evidence, and there's also this issue of attribution, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the lecture. I won't play you the video of Daniel Pink, but I'd recommend you look him up. He talks about and it's a little bit too long a video actually, but Daniel Pink is famous for talking, particularly and recently writing about the danger of extrinsic rewards, such as pay or bonuses or commissions, etc., in destroying people's motivation to do things. And I'll give you a bit of an example. I mean, I've shown these pictures here of a person in a gym. Now, the person in the gym pays money to the gym and happily goes using a stair climbings and rowing machine and lifts weights. Whereas if you paid him to do that, he wouldn't want to do it very long. And other people lifting weights and climbing stairs are getting paid for it, and is much less keen to actually climb stairs than a person in a gym. I'll give another example from my own history, from an old family friend who told me when he was younger he used to do a bit of gambling on the horses. He used to go down to the TAB office and place his bets and generally lose. However, he met an old man who spent a lot more time observing the form of horses and noticed that he tended to place bets and win. And he asked the fellow, could he have a tip? He gave him a tip and he won. And the next week the same thing happened, and it's a little bit like a fairy story, it just happens to be true. The old man would give this family friend of mine tips and he would win. However, he felt a little bad about it after a few weeks and started to give the old man some kickbacks, pay him for the tips effectively. And from that point onwards, so the story goes, the quality of the tips deteriorated badly. When you start getting paid for something that you are doing for the joy of it, you begin to develop a focus on the pay, and you begin to develop risk aversion, for example. And in the case of tipping for gambling, your brain no longer is easily focusing on just all the variables and taking the punt, taking the risk that you otherwise would, but instead your mind is starting to focus on the reward itself. And that's Daniel Pink's point. He's written a whole book about it. I can't quite remember, but I think it did extremely well in the New York Times list. And there's a nice little section in the textbook also talking about how helping others, something that I've got a bit of a unhealthy need to do sometimes, can in fact disempower them. And I've had an occasion recently with a particular student, a postgraduate student, where I've been helping with a particular milestone that he has to reach. And I've noticed that instead of him feeling better and better as he approaches that milestone, he's been feeling worse and worse. And I asked him why. And he said, well, my project, my thesis, doesn't really feel like mine anymore. So by helping, we disempower people. And this issue of control and self and autonomy is a key issue in relation to motivators. In the next chapter, we talk a little bit, there is something further on creativity, but I thought it was worthwhile, particularly in relation to what I said just about the gambling tips and Daniel Pink's video, which talks about creativity as well, to talk briefly about creativity. And creativity is the ability to produce not just new ideas, but ones that have some value. So, for example, coming up with an iPhone that's a different color or something like that. It's new, but does it have some additional value? Is it in itself creative? In a business sense, that second form of creativity is more important, whereas in an artistic sense, creativity can be just purely visual and with very little function other than artistic. What's the word I'm looking for? Too early in the morning to come up with the long word that I'm looking for. Anyway, the three-component model of creativity is probably one that you need to remember. So creativity forms at the hub of three intersecting skills. Now, the one that we're talking about here is the creativity skills, the arty ability to think outside the square, to come up with new ideas. But you also need to be motivated, because as I think I've said, and I'm sure you intuitively know, you can have a skill, but if you can't be bothered using it, there's not much point to it. You need to be driven to carry that skill out. And finally, expertise. It's an interesting one. Expertise, like I was very, the example I used in class yesterday is from a very early age. I was interested, I was motivated to write, and I also probably had some natural ability. I have no idea how much, but I suspect I was a little bit more creative than the average child. But I was very motivated, and I developed the expertise by, even as quite a young child, writing lots of novels and plays and short stories and essays, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote. I wrote for fun, and even though I wrote extremely badly, with time I became expert at it. And by becoming expert at it, now when I sit in front of a keyboard or hold a pen in my hand and start and write, that expertise is a given. It's kind of like a reserve, a resource that I have sitting in the background that allows me, with my task motivation and skills, creativity, to actually lift it to the next level. So expertise is like the training that an athlete does. Motivation is the drive to turn up to the front line. And creativity would be, in the case of the athlete, that kind of natural high-speed twitch muscles that athletes have, the ability to react to reaction time, things that you can't train. So those three things form into the three-component model of creativity. I am talking too slowly, and I've got too long a video to do. Okay, so people's beliefs. Self-efficacy is a term that you should familiarise yourself with. It's a beliefs about our abilities to do something, to carry something out, to produce a certain level of performance, and to have an influence over events that affects our lives. So it's a core concept in self-esteem, for example, which we talked about before in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, and it's a term you should be aware of because it's also something that's valuable in the workplace. There are methods that you can increase self-efficacy, and I talked briefly about my own experience with writing by increasing inactive mastery through repetitive practice. Vicarious modelling is something we all need to be aware of as managers, as parents, as friends. What we do is just as powerful as what we say. So, for example, as a manager, I always stayed longer. I didn't tell people to work hard within my business, but I worked later, arrived to work earlier, and worked more intensely at my work than my staff. Not all of them, but in order to demonstrate what I wanted from them. And that was a lot more compelling than ordering them to work hard, or threatening them, or even paying them to work hard. And as parents, it's something you need to be aware of. If you smoke, but tell your children not to smoke, you're on a losing path there, I have to say. So verbal persuasion's the easier version of it. Oh, please work hard. And as we said, you need to have a certain level of arousal, a certain energy, in order to be able to carry out means to achieve self-efficacy. I used to say self-efficacy, and I believe efficacious is the pronunciation of the verb. Okay, so an additional thing to be aware of is expectation effects, which one of my favourite areas in psychology, something that I have talked to you previously about, the power of expectation. So when you are at a job interview, you recruit someone, and it's shining through your eyes that you believe that person's going to be a great recruit. That sense of your expectation about that recruit is going to impact upon that person's ability to perform. And the Galatia effects, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, Galatia, they relate not to just expectancy, which is the Pygmalion effect, but also you saying, I've got great hopes for you, Brian, or Jane, transmitting that more obviously. Believing something makes it true, being told directly. Now, the trouble with self-efficacy as a term, it's worth pointing out, the textbook covers this in nice depth, is that, IQ and personality do overlap very heavily with it. Things like conscientiousness and are quite heavily related to self-efficacy. So is it a term that is independently important? Is it a construct that's independently important? That's a good question. So the textbook briefly mentions classical conditioning, and I will see, effectively, I might turn down the volume if I can on this.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle.
Saliva. Eat or food.
Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
Instinct or reflex.
5 минут
Experiments got fairly
42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food.
right. And
He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5.
see the
Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble.
or
As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine,
swine.
they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food.
For example, he's putting the boards up, but the key thing to remember is that if we attach a reward to something that has no rewarding characteristics, for example, money is the classical conditioning. Money is a piece of paper or a plastic credit card that has little intrinsic delightfulness, but it has been so closely associated with positive outcomes such as holidays, food, movies, etc., that it has the very strong classically conditioned power. It's highly appealing. Contrast with operant conditioning, which is very similar but different.
Are you finished?
Volume.
Thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please.
So Sheldon is using operant conditioning here. He says that if you behave this way, this reward follows that. And using these this is how you can use rewards in the workplace. It's not necessarily as we've seen from Daniel Pink's work, the best way of encouraging motivation in people, but it certainly is a good way of shaping behaviour into particular directions. Using fines, for example, that's negative conditioning or punishment, or these rewards. But the interesting thing that's worth pointing out is that these kinds of learning take place without too much going on in your head. You can train chickens to do this kind of thing. You can train chickens to play ping pong, as one video when I was an undergrad myself famously showed me. Okay, so expectancy theory. Whereas, in the case of Pavlov's dogs, for example, they'd learnt to expect something, that, if they waited near the door, the meat would come. Now, expectancy theory is talking a little bit about something else here. It talks about how the amount of effort you put into something, your expectation that it will lead to a high level of performance or a low level of performance if you have a pessimistic about that particular relationship, and that particular performance will lead to a particular reward. Having a situation where the employee believes that their effort will lead to a good performance and their performance will lead to a good reward, that leads to kind of optimal results from the employer's perspective. So that's basically expectancy theory in a nutshell. And the textbook refers to different kinds of distributive justice, and we'll quickly go through this. Distributive justice is a sense of fairness about how goods are distributed. Organisational justice is a more global sense of what's fair in the workplace. And procedural justice is something to do with that the procedures are being followed, or due process, in an unbiased way. So I often make the point that males are much more hung up on due process than females are. So males are much more likely to reach for the rule book. Even as little kids, when they're playing sport, they're much more likely to feel that my mum says, or the rule book says, or the rules are, and that's a sense of procedural justice. Whereas women are much more likely to think in terms of relationships and the nuances. Well, look, on this occasion, because of that, we'll let that go. Boys are much less likely to let that go. So the job characteristics model, this is a good, strong model, Heckman and Oldman, and it talks about these 5 types of characteristics of work that can lead to job satisfaction. So skill variety, for example, if you're only making one component, and you just do that one component of a certain product, that job is low in skill variety and has relatively low meaningfulness and low job satisfaction. And similarly with task identity, if you're able to see the holistic part of the task, that you can, for example, with a pizza, it's an example I used in class yesterday, you can make the whole of the pizza, not just chop up the olives. That gives it a stronger sense of task identity and leads to greater job satisfaction. Task significance means, the impact of what you're doing. If you're about to complete a project that's going to save the world, that will have high task significance. But if that project is going to save 5 cents, that's going to have a low task significance. Autonomy is, of course, one's sense of control over and ability to do what you want to do and prioritise what you want to do in the workplace. That's autonomy. And feedback's another key element. If you do a task and you have no idea, let's say you to slip the pizza through a slot out into the front counter and never see the smiles of the customers, that would be low in feedback and subsequently low in job satisfaction. So these are the three components, the three moderating variables: sense of responsibility, the knowledge of results, and the meaningfulness of work. It does tend to be fairly Western orientated, these concepts, and they also individualistic. The reality is that in Asian or collectivist cultures, this kind of focus on job satisfaction is somewhat less important, and there's a greater weight given to group outcomes that are satisfactory. Group harmony, for example, is creating greater job satisfaction. Now, you can create better jobs by a variety of things to improve these five: by rotating jobs around so that you're not always chopping the olives, by enriching the jobs so that in addition to chopping the olives, you can get to chop the onions, for example, by increasing the sense of the employee control, and that can be done either through voice or through other direct means of increasing autonomy within the workplace. A sense of control, as I've said multiply through this course, is one of the keys. And there is the textbook, and I won't talk about them here, talks about a range of different new characteristics of jobs that increase the sense of control. But in relation to pay, this is the one that I would recommend you focus more of your focus on. There are a number of different forms of sharing, of increasing pay incentives for staff, and that can be piece rate, and piece rate is where, for every pizza you get paid $1. Merit base, where there's more global methods of performance rating, get rewarded by for example, rewards at the end of the year or end of the month or fortnightly basis. But they do rely a little bit on performance appraisals, which are more subjective, and bonuses on performance. But and then finally the profit sharing plans, which are quite popular. And one of the good characteristics of this kind of method of payment from an employer's perspective is that when things are going bad, you don't pay out as much. It's scaled to your ability to pay as an employer. From the employee's perspective, it has the opposite problem, and that is that when things go bad, they go bad as well. They share in the downside, but maybe don't share in the upside as much as the employer. The other thing about these types of rewards is that as an employee, you do not remember the importance of control. And the problem here, of course, is that you do not have control over all the things that relate to these performance measures. Even when it comes down to, maybe you can with piece rate. You have the full ability to produce more pizzas as long as the supply chain of olives and cheese, etc., is coming through at a regular flow. You should be able to produce pizzas, and as long as you're not feeling sick, in which case the sick pay and you can go home. But the thing about profit sharing plans, for example, which have become increasingly popular, is that whether a company makes a profit or not can be based upon a lot of factors that are well and truly outside of your control. Your company shares can crash due to a subsidiary in Fiji doing something dreadfully wrong, for example. And that what you can be powering away at work, performing extremely well and creatively and with lots of motivation, determination, and still not do well out of those profit sharing plans. And so, but the other warning, of course, which harking back to Daniel Pink again, is that these tend to produce relatively short-term boosts in performance and then subside into the background. Now, I wanted to explain why they subside into the background. It's a nice segue, actually, to the chapter on perception and decision-making. I'll just ask you to focus briefly on part of, let's say, that area there and see what happens. For some of you, it may not happen, but what generally happens, if you focus on one part of it, the other parts start to move around on the screen. And this is not a video file. This is caused by something called microsaccades. It's quite eerie because I'm looking at it, it's all the time moving, like little worms moving around in circles, when in fact it's actually not moving at all. Now, this is part of the human perceptual system. This is why it's worth mentioning. Now, the eye consists of lots of little colour sensors, red, blue, and green colour sensors, and together they give us one single visual picture. But the thing about the eye, and one of the reasons why our eyes flicker from part to part, is because in order for this system to work, and this happens with the sense of smell and the sense of sound, not just the visual sense and sense of pain, what the body or the perceptual system requires is continually flickering around. Here's a little experiment you can play at home. Play a single note on a keyboard or a piano or on a guitar, and just play it again and again. Guitar actually is a little bit too, it doesn't produce a single pure note as frequently as, for example, a piano does. But if you play a single note on the piano again and again, after 20 or 30 notes, the sound will subtly start to change. So what happens there is, another great experiment, and I'm going to have to make this into 2 videos, it's just not going to fit by the look of it. What happens with the human perceptual system, and the experiment that I want to tell you about, is that if you force a human to focus on a single image or perceptual input, that perceptual input will disappear or change. To talk about money, for example, wages are always exactly the same. And whereas at first you get very excited about your pay packet, after 6 or 8 weeks, that excitement decreases, and you do not have that same sense of thrill that you did from the first week when you first received it. Now, bonuses do have that sense of snap to it. We certainly notice them, but unless that bonus increases next time or decreases, you're going to get virtually no impact or lesser impact. So the degree to which we notice things depends a little bit on the degree to which they change. So some of the things that impact on perception are things like motivation, and I'll just let that stay on the screen. I urge you to press pause and have a look at those different factors, because I do want to try and get through this in a single video, because I think it will be easier to upload. Attribution theory, one of the strongest, most important theories in psychology, very, very big, important theory. When we observe behavior, we attempt to explain why it happened. That's one of the things that makes us humans, is our desire to be Sherlock Holmes and use our brains and use our logic to work out why it happens. And in order to determine these attributions, we tend to use these 3 different characteristics, and the outcome of this decision is whether it was caused by, in the case of, let's say, I get a promotion. Now, I could attribute that promotion towards myself. I've had a brilliant year, I've done extremely well, I deserve the promotion. The reason I'm promoted is because of Olaf. Or alternatively, I could say the boss is feeling generous, the university's got money to spare, I happened to make some very good alliances during the year with co-authors on some top research papers. The situation enabled me to get the promotion. Now, it's not surprising to find that humans, particularly in Western style cultures, tend to attribute excessively towards internal causes of things to behave. But in determining external events, when it doesn't come to ourselves, but to external events, we tend to use these 3 different characteristics to judge distinctiveness, whether different behaviours occur in different situations; consensus, whether people respond the same way; to the way other people respond in a particular situation, and consistency, whether a particular person responds or a situation happens every time in the same way. So those three characteristics. I do recommend that you look at these particular types of common errors that we make. I'll just quickly go through them. Fundamental attribution error is where we tend to underestimate the importance of external factors, overestimate generally internal factors. It's a Western bias, and in Asian cultures or collectivist cultures, there's much less of that happening. There's a fascinating section to the textbook which talks about how when you show a photograph of a car against a busy sort of background, Asian people with their eye movements will tend to focus on the context, whereas in Western individualistic cultures, we tend to focus on the car, the foreground. And that actually shows how fundamental the fundamental attribution error is in and how strong that urge is in Western cultures. Selective perception is you see what you want to see, so on the basis of your background or experience. Self-serving bias, you tend to blame others for your failures and yourself for your success. Halo effect, for example, this is one that happens commonly in job interviews, where the person walks in and mentions, I went to school with your brother or something like that, and you like your brother, and has that positive initial effect, and then that colours everything that you see about that person or hear about that person in the remaining part of the interview. Stereotyping, you know what that means, and contrast effects. If you have 5 different applicants for a job, and one of them is mediocre, but the others are bloody awful, the mediocre one will come off looking extra good. And of course, as I imply, these perceptions really do have quite a lot of importance in how we behave in the workplace. Now, humans, you're probably starting to get a quick picture of this from this lecture, do suffer from a lot of flaws. I mean, we may have great brains, and we may have one of the things that characterize us as Homo sapiens is our wisdom, but our wisdom doesn't carry through in everything we do. So the classic rational decision-making process involves, coolly defining a problem, identifying criteria of success and failure, associating weights to different options, developing alternative plans, evaluating those plans, and then selecting the best plan. But as the great poem by Robert Frost, it's Scottish Robert anyway, he said the best laid plans of mice and men oft go astray. He actually used slightly more Scottish words than that. But as a manager, you'll find that despite your best efforts to think through a problem in a very logical way, that some of the greatest ideas that you come up with and enact with every care taken still don't work. And what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is possibly stabbing, throwing a dart at a map, or using intuition. And the textbook does talk about some of the values of using intuition in certain kinds of cases. But the trouble with the reality is, and the reason that rational decision making doesn't always work out the way we'd like, is that the world is very complex. So much is unknown, and even in assigning weights to certain things, this is good because of that, but that's good because of that. How do you value those two values? How do you weight those two values? Which of them is the more important to you? There are also, the problem is that, that every good side has a bad side. So we work effectively with imperfect information, and that's called bounded rationality. And we've got biases, such as, the randomness bias is a misunderstanding of the concept of randomness. People all the time talk in terms of coincidence, and people have a very strong tendency to believe in that particular events that are purely random have meaning. They believe in that they have the ability to predict things that they do not have the ability to predict. Hindsight bias is where we see in retrospect we think something was much more obvious and likely than what it was. Anchoring bias is another important one. Textbook gives good coverage of this, but anchoring bias is one that you need to be aware of. Is that if I were to say to you, look, what's the average wage of reindeer farmers in Iceland? More or less than 45,000 euros. And if I were to say it like that, you'd anchor your response around the 45,000 euros. It's a great way of biasing when you're trying to have a competition with a friend and you're trying to get them to answer wrong. Give them a figure that's way out of scale and they'll anchor their responses around that figure, the 45,000 euros. It'd be quite different if I said more or less than 15,000 euros for the reindeer farmer, and you'd come up with a different response. The overconfidence bias, something we all suffer from, except for depressed people. Interestingly, there's quite a lot of literature showing that depressed people actually have a more accurate worldview than non-depressed people, and it's kind of disturbing, isn't it, to think. But anyway, availability heuristic, I should probably mention that one as well. Availability heuristic relates to, for example, we tend to think of our chance of getting murdered in one of the big cities in Australia as way higher if we go out late at night than what it really is, simply because news programs do not report on not murdered people. That's boring. They do not report on close encounters that do not lead to murder. They only report on murders. And so that murder in Melbourne or Brisbane or Sydney becomes highly available to us when we think about a particular possibility of murder. There's a number of different factors that influence bias. I did mention with depressive people that high self-esteem is an issue. And with gender, women tend to spend more time thinking and men tend to jump to conclusions a little quicker. The other thing is that we tend to be over-influenced, and perhaps even accurately, by things that have happened. And in fact, the best predictor of something is what happened in the past in relation to that something. We need to be also aware that that things like high IQ do not protect us, or particular skill do not protect us from these biases. So, I've made a note here that high IQ doesn't stop us from falling prey to some of these problems like the availability heuristic or anchoring problems. We tend to still overcommit to projects even when we know that there's a risk of failure. The one that I should mention there too, which is one that I've suffered from in the past in relation to personality. I'm a highly achievement-orientated person, and that is a failing in decision-making or a risk in decision-making. Because I'm so achievement-orientated, if I feel I'm beginning to fail, I will not stop and rationally think about the problem as much as I should. I will tend to commit more and more resources because I'm so hung up on achieving. And I don't know when to quit. So that's another example of the degree to which characteristics of personality can lead to some of these biases and improper decision making. Keys to good decision making, and this is the final slide, and we're heavily over term, is be aware of these risks. Be honest with yourself in relation to the fact that you are not the one person in the universe who is not vulnerable to these flawed forms of thinking. Beware of the risks and the value of the group, and beware of the value and the risks of intuition. In relation to the group, I'll just briefly mention, this being psychology, it's a lot about group psychology, particularly organisational psychology, organisational behaviour. Decision making in groups, and if you have a moment, read up, for example, on what happened with the President Kennedy back in the 60s in relation to Cuba. There's a lot of discussion about what happened in the cabinet room there in the White House, where they were talking about what decisions to make, and how the group coalesced around a decision fairly early and no one spoke up against it because of the power of conformity within the group. So even at a high level, intelligent people, highly expert people, can suffer from biases caused by group think. However, on the other hand, if you use a group well and use diversity of expertise and diversity of orientation towards decision making, risk versus non-risk, you can actually get more valuable, well thought out decisions. Anyway, sorry for the performance today. It wasn't my best. I only just feel I got through that, and I've got more lectures today, so feel sorry for me. Thanks very much, and we'll catch you next week. Or actually, no, we won't catch you next week. Next week's the mid-semester break. Hopefully you'll use that break to keep on working on your assignments and keep on reading the textbook and preparing for the quizzes. I know I'm super boring, but in terms of good decision making, using your week off towards advancing your course, not just this course, but your other courses at CQU, that's well worthwhile. Good tactics, good strategy.